am Loree Cook-Daniels. I am Forge's Policy and Program Director. I go by any pronouns. Most people call me she. And I will be introducing some of Forge's resources for trans youth and also some of the key national youth resources, which probably Brian J. will be adding to. Next, please. Our action opportunity this month, I encourage everyone to try and take a little action to move things forward. Brian J. is actually not in Waukesha tonight with the school board because they are probably going to pass this resolution whether we're there or not, but we need to try and explain to them why this is such a bad idea. So let me read to you the part of their new parental rights and transparency resolution that we think is problematic. Student personal and gender identity. The district celebrates the diversity of our Waukesha community and expects that students feel safe and welcome in the school environment. Staff will cooperate with parents to ensure students are referred to in ways that represent the student's identity. A, district staff will not be permitted to call a minor student by names, nicknames, or pronouns other than commonly shortened or abbreviated full names, for example, William to Bill or Jennifer to Jen, or pronouns consistent with the student's biological sex without written permission from the parents. B, students will use shared bathroom and locker room facilities according to their biological sex. Students who request exceptions for shared facility use shall have a plan on file with the school district that is determined by the superintendent not to introduce an excess of safety or privacy risks for other district students, and that is approved by the parent. And C, students will participate in athletics programs consistent with their biological sex and the rules of the Wisconsin Interscholastic Athletics Association. Any consideration of alternative placement due to a student's gender identity must comply with the Wisconsin Interscholastic Athletics Association policy and be approved by the board. They are likely to approve this resolution tonight, as I said. However, it would be good to go on record explaining why these policies are so damaging. Both B and C above could require families with trans children in Waukesha schools to out those children and negotiate or renegotiate their child's school conditions, whether or not those families had previously chosen to out their children to school officials. I will just note that many of the parents that Forge works with, and presumably also Brian, are actually have their children in schools where the schools are not aware that the children are trans. Moreover, depending on what bathroom and sports agreements are made, the policies may also force the child to be outed to the rest of the student body. The policy would also forcibly out trans children who have good reason to believe they are at risk if their parents learn of their gender identity, but who may not understand the risks they run revealing their identity to teachers, staff, or peers. So the action agenda piece, action opportunity, has the information on how to contact the Waukesha Board of Education. And they also, on their website, which we've given you the link to, has information on how to contact each school board member individually if you would like to do that. And Brian, I didn't tell you I was going to put you on the spot, but is there anything you want to add to this?
Sorry, I was navigating that. I tried to unmute on my computer. I remember that I'm actually talking to you from my phone. Sorry, everybody, I've had a day with technology. Yeah, no, Loree, I really appreciated you framing it in the context of this could force families that hadn't previously shared their students' gender identity or trans status to schools, I often default to thinking about students who haven't yet come out to their families, and how in order to be treated respectfully, they would have to be forced to come out to their families, and thus the policies create essentially second-class citizens for students that don't have family support. So I really appreciate your analysis around that. I think the only other thing that I would add is this resolution also continues to double down on the something Waukesha has been working on since last year, which would prohibit educators from having any sort of affirming signage, whether it's for students of color or for LGBT students, on their walls or on their doors, or district issued computers or whatever, because the district has decided that being supportive of LGBT youth or showing pride flags or affirming youth of color is considered political, right? So the resolution also would ban educators from having any type of signage that would be considered political, but it's left open for broad interpretation. So, and it's just an example of Waukesha doubling down on work they've been doing since last year, which is unfortunate because the district had previously done a really good job actually of learning and taking steps to really follow best practices in supporting LGBT youth. But that's me starting to editorialize. But it does show the impact of particularly the past spring elections and why it's important to engage supportive and progressive, or at least even old-fashioned moderate folks on school boards, because right now the Waukesha School Board has at least one QAnon supporter, as well as two Christian or religious extremists on the board. It's I think a 9-person majority. Like all 9 board members are leaning conservative. So, Loree, I agree that it will be passed, but it's still good to register opposition to such policies like this.
Good. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Next slide. Now we've gotten to audience participation. Is there anyone here that has an event, an achievement, or news that they would like to share with us? Nick has noted in the chat that the resolution says they honor the Wisconsin Interscholastic Athletics Association policies for gender participation, but that policy is to allow them to participate in their affirmed gender.
I just commented in the, or I just dropped into the chat, which is true. And actually WIAA came out in opposition to previous legislative efforts to take control away from WIAA as far as determining how trans athletes can participate. One of our major complaints of this, the guidance procedures that WIAA has, is that what they've adopted is something that makes sports participation particularly easy for trans boys, but creates significant hurdles for trans girls to participate in sports in a way that affirms their identity, which essentially somebody would need to have family support, access to insurance, and insurance that provides covers gender affirming care to be able to really even have a shot at being able to participate in their gender. So WIA policy, when it was created, opted to follow more restrictive access, as opposed to, say, the state of Washington, which had basically said, if this is how you identify consistently, persistently, insistently, then we're gonna then you should be able to participate in a way that aligns with your gender identity. So Nick, you are correct. It does allow access, but it creates different obstacles depending on how you identify. And again, oftentimes they're very inaccessible for a lot of young people.
Thank you. So now we're going to go into youth resources, and I will, I think I have 4 or 5 to give you before I turn this over to Brian. So next, please. Again, it's, I'm Loree Cook-Daniels is who's speaking to you now, and then Brian will be next. Next, please. Forge has a several-year-old support group for parents of trans kids. It meets every month. It's been meeting online since COVID started. It's the third Sunday of the month at 2:00. We also have a Facebook page and we have a listserv. So those are the ways that we share resources if people cannot actually attend the support group. This is one of our parents and one of her daughters. Okay, go ahead, next. The Trans Youth Equality Foundation has really great website that has resources for youth and parents and educators and providers. They talk about youth camps. They have extensive book lists divided by audience. They have legal resources, and then you can see we've added plus, plus, plus. I definitely urge you to check this out if you're interested in resources about trans youth. Next, please. The Trans Youth Handbook is a legal document, and it's by Harvard Law School, along with some other partners. They quote their subtitle is "Helping You Learn About Your Legal Rights in Different Areas of Your Life." For those of you that like looking at pretty pictures, you should check out the website because they have some gorgeous graphics. Next, please. The Gender Affirming Pediatric Care Toolkit is from the Fenway Institute and some other very high-level trans and LGBT health resources. Some of the things that they cover in their toolkit are foundational concepts and terminology, social gender affirmation, gender affirming medical care, gender affirming mental health care, navigating insurance. It's really a very helpful and inclusive guide that people that when you're talking about care for trans youth and children, this could be very helpful. Next, please. Schools in Transition is a guide for supporting transgender students in K through 12 schools. It's put out by Gender Spectrum. It includes a gender support plan, a gender communication plan, transgender students in school bathrooms, and responding to concerns. Brian is noting in the chat that he loves Schools in Transition, so I'm really glad that has an endorsement. And now I would like to turn it over to Brian J., who is representing GSAFE and is our expert on youth stuff in Wisconsin. Brian?
Sure. Thanks, Loree. Can people hear me or understand what I'm saying? So I've been having tech issues. So I'm seeing thumbs up, I think. So yes. Okay, awesome. Thank you. I'm seeing people pop in the chat. So, hey, everybody, it's really nice to be here tonight. And Loree and Michael and Caleb and everybody else here tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So, and Loree, I love the resources that you shared. There were some that were new to me, and it's also really nice to see the ones that I'm like, oh, those are my go-to ones. I should mention that the Schools in Transition, it's been in the process of being rewritten for at least the last 2 or 3 years. So I'm really interested to see what they come up with as a new edition. And I'm sure it's hard for them because there's so much churning right now around particularly trans youth in schools, that it should be interesting to see what the thought leaders across the country are able to identify and provide for folks. But it really is centered on, it really provides the best practices that have been identified by school professionals, educators, folks in the community that have been doing this work for years. And so sometimes, with that resource in particular, I'll let folks know that, these best practices that we're saying, we're not just plucking them out of the sky, right? These aren't something that we thought of last night. When schools engage in these, they're engaging in best practices that their colleagues have developed over the last couple of decades. So, so that's one of the things I like about that. Another really great thing about that resource is that in the appendix, I want to say it's Appendix C or D, but I could be wrong. They've actually included some talking points that you can literally hand an administrator so that they have things to say to families who call or email saying, why are you letting like a girl use the boy or a boy use the girl's bathroom? Or why are you supporting trans youth? And it gives administrators the words to be supportive. And I think sometimes what we can do as adult allies or adults in the community is to share those resources with the people that need to have our backs, because oftentimes they haven't had a chance to think about what would we say if we get challenged, or what will we say when an angry parent comes at us or a curious parent comes at us. So there's some good talking points in the appendix of that resource. So I definitely give that double thumbs up. That was me just kind of wandering into the wilderness. So hey, let me introduce myself a little bit more. And I just have a couple of slides to share just about GSAFE. And then true story, I've had so many random things come up this week that I have not finished the rest of the slides. And so I'm working from a Google Doc, which I will share with folks and make that available to folks later as well. So keeping it real, the world is a little bit bonky right now. So, but anyway, so about GSAFE. So my name is Brian J. My pronouns are he, him. I am the co-executive director of GSAFE, which is a statewide organization. We're based in Madison, and we've been around since the mid-90s in one form or another. But we work statewide with youth, with educators, and with families, with the goal of making sure trans and queer youth are safe and affirmed and included in schools, which we know isn't always the case, especially, well, I was going to say, especially once we get outside of some of our larger cities, but also it's not happening in our larger cities. And as I mentioned, we've been around since the mid-90s. We were previously a chapter of GLSEN, which is a national K-12 education organization. But we struck out on our own in the mid-2000s. I've somehow managed to be with the organization for 20 years, which I'm not quite sure how that happened, but I just turned 50. So I'm almost spent half of my life with GSAFE. But what I want to say is that there's already a lot of expertise in this room. There's definitely expertise that I have, but I really already appreciate the knowledge that is being shared in this space. And I want to encourage people to start keep doing that, because I know that you know your community or your situation better than I do. So what does GSAFE do? GSAFE historically has focused on developing the leadership of queer and trans youth, right, or LGBTQ plus students. And we've done that in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's working through a youth council that we have that brings together youth from across the state to advise and guide GSAFE, as well as develop their own leadership. We also work with student leaders of student clubs across the state, commonly now known as Gender and Sexuality Alliances, or GSAs. There's been other names in the past, but more and more schools are using the more inclusive language of Gender and Sexuality Alliances. To the last time that we counted, which was before the pandemic, there was about 260 school-based GSAs across Wisconsin at the high school, middle school, and the, excuse me, and the elementary level. Which has been exciting. When I started with GSAFE back, 20 years ago, there was maybe 2 handfuls of GSAs across the state. So that means clearly there's not a GSA available to every student in Wisconsin, but the movement keeps growing. Although I should say that I have seen an increase in efforts to either prohibit GSAs from forming at the local level, either by school boards or school administrators, which is definitely a step backwards from the trajectory that we've been on. And I also wouldn't be surprised if we might see some type of legislation proposed here in the Wisconsin Assembly or the legislature sometime this next year, seeking to ban or prohibit GSAs in schools. We haven't seen it yet, but it would not surprise us to see something like that. So that's some of the work that we do. We also provide professional development for educators across Wisconsin. That's primarily the role that I take on at the organization from a programmatic standpoint. I really do travel from, Milwaukee to La Crosse, Bayfield to Beloit. I've worked across the state working with thousands of educators, really helping them understand what best practices are and how to implement that on a day-to-day basis. And I'm always happy to report that there's so many educators across Wisconsin who are interested and excited and determined to figure out how to create safe learning environments in our schools for our trans and queer youth. Some additional programming that we do for youth that tie back to that leadership piece. We do summer camps, we do day-long conferences, we provide scholarships for students, and again, we'll go out and visit student clubs. I should mention for folks that are interested, on April 6th, and I should drop this in the chat, we'll be having our annual Safe Schools, Safe Communities conference, which is an opportunity for adults who work with youth or are concerned about youth to come together to learn best practices and learn from each other and share with each other. And that's going to be at the UW Green Bay on April 6th. So thinking about that professional development piece. The other thing that we've had to do more and more is to advocate for social justice, both in school districts and communities, as well as down at the state capitol, which fortunately is just a couple blocks away from our office here in Madison. But we've been doing a lot of advocacy at down at the capitol, oftentimes to prevent or fight back against harmful bills proposed targeting trans youth. On the local level, since 2005, we've been working with Wisconsin school districts one at a time to add specific protections for trans and non-binary students. When we started doing that back in 2005, there were 0 school districts in Wisconsin that had protections specifically laid out for trans and non-binary students. The last time we checked, over half of Wisconsin, actually almost 65% of Wisconsin students attended schools where they had protections based on gender identity and gender expression. And that's work that we've been doing one district at a time for getting close to 20 years now. And that's something that's been important to us. I think I've already mentioned this, so I'm just gonna skip over this. Just to give us a quick snapshot, I'm just one of a number of people at GSAFE, so I have an amazing team of allies. We're growing, but we're still a pretty small and feisty organization. But I'm really fortunate to have a really great crew of folks working with me and doing amazing things that I have no capacity to do with students and with educators and around advocacy. That's just my brief overview of GSAFE. I wanted to pause briefly and see if people had specific questions about GSAFE that I could respond to. Otherwise, I'm happy to transition to a couple of things that Loree had prompted me to consider talking about. So I wanted to talk about some different resources to expand upon or maybe duplicate, hopefully not duplicate some of the things that Loree had talked about, but just thinking about some additional resources for LGBT youth in Wisconsin. So I'm just thinking about a few examples meant to be in some sequence, but ultimately end up a little bit random. But I always like to shout out our statewide partners, Diverse and Resilient, that have home base in Milwaukee, as well as in the Fox Valley area, so Appleton, Neenah area. They work across the LGBT community, including with young people. Oftentimes very focused on health and wellness. They're a great resource, particularly if you're in the Milwaukee or Fox Valley area. There's resources that they can provide either for schools or for youth or for queer and trans folks. They're just a great resource to have in Wisconsin. And of course, I should have put at the top here, let me do that right now. I knew they would plug themselves anyway, but let me please mention Forge, which is great to have you here in Wisconsin. I did want to point out that when I say, and I should say it's the Department of Public Instruction, DPI recently reallocated one of their staff members' time and positioned to be more focused on LGBTQ topics. And that's the first time, to my knowledge, that DPI has done that. So Molly Herman is a consultant for DPI, and she's just a good go-to if you're experiencing something in your school district, right? Either as a parent, or your child or a child that you care about is encountering something, or as an educator who's trying to provide support. GSAFE is definitely a resource, but I'd also encourage folks to reach out to Molly, and she might be able to connect you to some additional resources at DPI. I also want to point out, because it sounds like there's folks from around the state, there are a number of community centers in Wisconsin, and I've named the ones that I could think of off the top of my head, but other folks that might know others, please drop those into the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and share if that's something that you can do. But I'm thinking that we have a number of LGBTQ plus community centers across Wisconsin, including in La Crosse, in Eau Claire, Milwaukee, as well as Racine, Kenosha area. And I believe each of those do youth-specific programs. There's also a community center here in Madison, but they focus on 18 and older as far as most of their programming. But again, those can be really great local resources for you, as well as provide connections to other folks in the community or looking for resources. Another great resource is Proud Theater, which is a youth theater program in various communities. And I don't remember exactly which communities they're in right now in Wisconsin. But they are, I believe they're in Milwaukee, I believe they're in Wausau, and I know they're in Madison as well. But if you go to their website, they'll provide more information. And it can be a really great way for queer and trans youth to find community with each other, as well as creating art and expressing themselves, or being the person behind the scenes doing stage tech. There's a place for all students in Proud Theater. A resource that I was just made aware of this past week is BATYA, which I believe stands for Bay Area Trans Youth Association. When I did a search for it, it came up with a Texas Bay Area Trans Youth Association. So I'm trying to track down the contact information for that, but that would be a resource for trans youth in the Green Bay area that's getting off the ground. I also want to point out that there's a number of PFLAG chapters across Wisconsin, and you can go to pflag.org to find more information. PFLAG is for the adults as well as family in the lives of queer and trans youth, and have been historically good resource for folks. Loree had mentioned Forge's parent group. I should also mention that there's at least one other parent group in Wisconsin called Transparent. And if you Google Transparent Madison, that should pull up contact information, and they meet monthly, I want to say on the third Tuesday night, and they pull in parents and families from really across South Central Wisconsin. Some folks come from at least 2 hours away to participate, and it's just a really great resource for families and the adults at home of queer or of trans and non-binary youth to connect and ask questions. They also have a very active email list, as well as a Facebook group as well. Loree, to add on to some of the national organizations that you mentioned, another great resource, especially for youth who might be isolated and not have access to any of these in-person resources, is Q Chat Space, which I was made aware of during the pandemic particularly, but it was kind of a hub for youth who are isolated or stuck at home without support to connect, but it's an adult moderated space, online space for queer and trans youth to connect with each other. Similarly, the Trevor Project both has a crisis line as well as an adult moderated chat space and opportunities to connect with adult supports for young people, as well as connecting young people to each other. And of course, the Trans Lifeline is a great resource, particularly to share with a young person who, or as well as a not so young person who might be needing to connect with another trans adult or another trans person, particularly in times of crisis. Loree, you had already mentioned Gender Spectrum, which was one of the organizations that helped out with the Schools in Transition resource. They have lots of great resources for families, for youth, for service providers, for medical professionals. It's another great resource. And the last resource I thought about sharing was the PATH Clinic, which is Madison-based, which is the Pediatric Adolescent Trans Health Clinic. I believe that's what it stands for. And somebody from Milwaukee, remind me what your clinic in Milwaukee is, or your resource in Milwaukee, because I forgot to write it down. My apologies. And maybe somebody can drop that in the chat. So thank you, Children's Hospital, thank you. So excellent, thank you. And I'm just looking at the chat to make sure that I'm not missing anything. So those were some resources I thought might be helpful to share. Loree had asked me to also maybe give a forecast about maybe what to expect from Wisconsin legislature this year, and you can see my notes. But what we know is that, nationally, there's already been 112 anti-LGBTQs introduced nationally this year, 60 of them specifically anti-trans. And most of those, of course, are targeting trans youth. So from all accounts, our Wisconsin, particularly the Republicans in Wisconsin, are going to continue to hew closely to that trend, targeting, introducing bills, a myriad of bills using LGBT youth, trans youth in particular, as a political wedge issue, and to try to create division and decrease supports for our young people. Another action item that you might be interested in is that tomorrow there's going to be a hearing at the Wisconsin State Capitol starting at 10:30 that would move to suspend a recently enacted administrative rule that prohibits the use of conversion therapy with youth by professional counselors, marriage and family therapists, as well as social workers. It's particularly the MPSW 20.02 parentheses 25. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But that's something that we know is happening. It's happening tomorrow. Again, it's probably quite likely that the committee that reviews administrative codes and rules is likely to approve the motion, but it's important for folks to voice their opposition to it. And for folks, the people making the decisions, to hear the reasons why they shouldn't be making these decisions. Also, earlier this week, we learned that Wisconsin legislators are circulating a library content bill, which essentially is a bill that would require local school districts to determine what would be socially acceptable by their community, what would be considered socially acceptable as far as content of books in their library collections. So basically saying, these books should meet the values of the community, but we're not telling you what those is, and create a headache for school districts. And of course, even though it doesn't say it, it's clearly designed to both limit access to LGBT books, right, or with LGBT content, and I would suspect also books affirming youth of color and books that talk about the history of race and racism in our country. So I know that that's being circulated right now. It has not received assembly number or Senate number, but that's circulating. I think based on how quickly they're already acting this year, that we can probably reasonably assume that we'll see more parental rights bills, right? And that's something that we're seeing popping up at local school levels. So for instance, this past month, the Hudson School District voted on a school policy that essentially similar to what Waukesha is looking at, which is essentially saying, parents have the right to tell schools what name and pronouns a student uses at school, among other things, and basically saying, schools essentially have to honor everything that if a parent says about how they treat and support their young person in schools, even if it's something that's abusive and that we know does harm. So I'm anticipating that we'll see more of those. That's very popular right now among legislatures, and there's a lot of copycat bills circulating. I suspect that we'll see more curriculum and book ban bills. Probably see bills pertaining to school facilities, particularly locker rooms and bathrooms. And I would not be surprised if we would again see something that would seek to bar medical professionals from providing gender affirming care to trans and non-binary youth. I don't think that we won't see that here in Wisconsin. So, and so, Loree, I feel like you already touched on what to do around the administrative code bill that we're asking people to weigh in on before tomorrow's. Oh, I'm sorry, you talked about Waukesha. So you already covered Waukesha really well. What I'm inviting people to do, and you can do that tonight, or you, either by emailing or picking up the phone and just calling an office and leaving a message. But particularly around this change to the administrative rule that would lift a currently existing ban from that prohibits social workers, professional counselors, and marriage and family therapists from engaging in conversion therapy or practicing conversion therapy on young people. We know that conversion therapy is widely banned, or I can't think of the right word. Almost every credible medical and youth health organization has come out against conversion therapy. It's not only ineffective, but it's also harmful, right? It's abusive behavior. And our elected officials need to know that that is not okay for us to allow that type of abuse towards young people in our state. So one of the things I'm going to encourage folks to consider doing, if you want to add an extra thing, is to reach out. And I've got a list of folks to reach out to here. It's on the further down here, but reaching out saying, as a Wisconsin voter, I'm contacting you as a member of the joint committee, the joint committee for the review of administrative rules to vote no on the motion to suspend administrative rules safeguarding conversion therapy protections, MPSW 20.02 parentheses 25. That's being considered at this week's executive session. And by this week, we mean tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. I have a list of committee members down here. We encourage folks to email all committee members. But if you can't email or call all committee members, the ones in bold are the three that we think are particularly important to hear from folks. And again, I cannot guarantee that this motion to exclude that prohibition is going, like, I can't guarantee that it's not going to happen, but it's really important for people to hear from us and to hear that from folks that are concerned about the harm that this will do to our young people. And that is that is all I really had planned for tonight. And I also recognize that we're starting to get a little bit over time. So I guess I'm going to pause and see either what questions folks have or if there's anything else that would be helpful for me to chat about.
Thank you very much, Brian. We are open for questions, chat or unmute yourself. And I, as I was sitting here, I was thinking, oh, I'm getting depressed. And I had to remind myself that part of the reason that we are doing these WiTEACH meetings is to remind ourselves that, yeah, there's a bunch of junk going on out there, and there's a lot of good work going out there and a lot of support. So I want to thank you, Brian, for all that you've been doing the last 20 years.